February 13th, 1945, 21:51 hours, Dresden, Germany. The evening air hung cold and brittle over the Elbe River, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke and boiled cabbage from 1,000 kitchen windows. In the Baroque heart of Dresden, street lamps flickered to life along the Brühlsche Terrasse, casting amber pools across cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Children's laughter echoed from the Altmarkt Square, where mothers clutched ration cards and spoke in hushed tones about the war that had, until now, remained a distant thunder. The city's spires, the Frauenkirche, the Hofkirche, the Kreuzkirche, pierced the darkening sky like stone prayers, their silhouettes framed against a horizon still untouched by flame. In the cafes that remained open, old men sipped ersatz, coffee, and reassured one another that Dresden was safe, that it held no military value, that the Americans and British would never waste their bombs on Florence, on the Elbe. Above them, the first stars appeared, cold and indifferent. And then, at precisely 21:51, the air raid sirens began their wail. The sound started low, a mechanical groan that seemed to rise from the earth itself, then climbed in pitch until it became a shriek that drowned out conversation, footsteps, heartbeats. For a moment, the city froze. Mothers grabbed children. Old men set down their cups. Refugees from the East, already traumatized by the Soviet advance, looked at one another with eyes that had seen too much. Most did not run. They had heard sirens before. False alarms, they thought. Or perhaps a few stray bombers passing overhead on their way to more strategic targets. Dresden had been spared for so long that many believed it would remain so. They had called the Allied bombers schwerfällige Riesen, clumsy giants, lumbering beasts that dropped their payloads with more noise than precision, that could be evaded, endured, survived. They had heard the stories from Berlin, from Hamburg, from Cologne, but those were industrial cities, military hubs. Dresden was different. Dresden was culture. Dresden was history. Dresden was supposed to be safe. They were wrong. In the winter of 1945, Germany was dying. Not the theatrical death of propaganda films, where soldiers fell clutching swastika flags and speaking of honor, but the slow, grinding death of exhaustion and arithmetic. By February, the Reich that had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga had contracted to a shrinking core of ash and defiance. The Red Army was closing from the east, a relentless tide that had already swept through Poland and was now hammering at the gates of Silesia. In the west, British and American forces had crossed into Germany proper, their mechanized columns grinding forward with an efficiency that spoke of industrial superiority so vast it defied comprehension. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had been reduced to a scattered collection of grounded aircraft and pilots too young or too old to matter. Fuel was gone. Ammunition was rationed. Hope, for those still capable of honesty, was gone. Yet in the midst of this collapse, Dresden had remained curiously untouched. While Berlin had been bombed 163 times, while Hamburg had burned in a firestorm that consumed 42,000 souls in a single night, Dresden had experienced only 2 minor raids. The city had become a refuge, swollen, with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. Trains arrived daily from the east, packed with hollow-eyed women and children who had walked through snow and fire to reach what they believed was sanctuary. The population, normally 600,000, had swelled to perhaps 1 million. The hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers, the parks filled with makeshift camps, and still the city's residents clung to the belief that Dresden would be spared, that its cultural treasures, its galleries, its opera house, its churches, would protect it like a talisman against the storm. This belief was not entirely irrational. For years, German propaganda had cultivated a narrative about Allied bombing that minimized its effectiveness while maximizing its barbarity. The British and Americans, the propaganda claimed, were terror bombers who struck blindly at civilian populations because they lacked the courage and precision to engage military targets. Their bombers were portrayed as lumbering, vulnerable machines, schwerfällige Riesen, that flew in predictable patterns, dropped their bombs with poor accuracy, and could be shot down in droves by determined flak crews and night fighters. This narrative was supported by selective evidence: footage of bombers going down in flames, statistics emphasizing German industrial production that continued despite the raids, testimony from survivors who emerged from cellars to find their neighborhoods damaged but not destroyed. What the propaganda did not show was the cumulative effect: the way each raid degraded Germany's ability to wage war, the way the bombers learned and adapted, the way precision improved and tonnage increased with each passing month. German soldiers, returning from the Western Front, brought with them a more nuanced understanding, though few spoke it aloud. They had seen the bomb craters that cratered roads and rail lines. They had witnessed entire factory complexes reduced to twisted steel and shattered concrete. They had watched supply lines collapse, fuel depots vanish, ammunition dumps explode, in cascades of secondary detonations that lit the horizon for hours. But even these men, veterans who had survived Normandy and the Ardennes, believed that the bombing could be endured, that Germany's decentralized industry and disciplined population would outlast the Allied campaign. They did not yet understand that the bombing had evolved beyond simple destruction. By 1945, the combined bomber offensive had become a science, a carefully calibrated instrument of industrial annihilation. The British bombed by night, using area bombing techniques perfected over years of trial and error. The Americans bombed by day, employing formations of hundreds of heavy bombers protected by swarms of long-range fighters. Together, they represented a capability that no nation on Earth had ever possessed: the ability to destroy an enemy's industrial capacity from the air, systematically and completely, while suffering losses their economies could absorb indefinitely. Dresden had not been forgotten. It had simply been waiting its turn. On the evening of February 13th, 796 Lancaster bombers of RAF Bomber Command lifted off from airfields across eastern England. They carried between them more than 2,700 tons of high-explosive and incendiary bombs. The mission was codenamed Operation Thunderclap, part of a broader strategy to support the Soviet advance by destroying eastern German cities that served as communication hubs and troop concentration points. Dresden was such a city. Its rail yards handled military transport moving to the Eastern Front. Its factories produced precision optics, cigarettes, and various war materials. Its population included thousands of military personnel on leave or recovering from wounds. These facts would be debated for decades afterward, but on the night of February 13th, they were sufficient justification for what was about to occur. The Pathfinder aircraft arrived first, dropping flares that turned night into day, marking the aiming point with cascades of red and green light that hung in the air like malevolent stars. The German anti-aircraft defenses opened fire, their searchlights sweeping the sky, their 88mm guns pumping shells into the darkness. But Dresden's defenses were minimal. Most of the heavy flak batteries had been moved to the Ruhr or to defend Berlin. Most of the night fighters had been grounded for lack of fuel. The city lay exposed, its Baroque heart gleaming in the flare light like a jewel on velvet. At 22:14, the first bombs fell. They came in waves, a precisely orchestrated, Symphony of destruction. First, the high explosives. 4,000-pound blockbusters that detonated with concussive force sufficient to blow out windows, collapse roofs, and expose the wooden interiors of buildings to the air. Then came the incendiaries, hundreds of thousands of 4-pound magnesium sticks that scattered across the city center like burning rain. They fell through broken roofs and shattered windows, lodging in attics and bedrooms, igniting curtains and furniture, setting ablaze the dry timber that formed the skeleton of Dresden's ancient buildings. Within minutes, thousands of individual fires merged into hundreds of conflagrations. Within half an hour, those conflagrations began to merge into something else entirely. The people of Dresden had crowded into cellars and shelters, as they had been trained to do. They sat in darkness, listening to the bombs fall, feeling the concussions shake dust from the ceiling, hearing the muffled roar of explosions that seemed to go on forever. When the all-clear finally sounded at 23:11, they emerged to find their city transformed. The streets glowed with firelight. The air rippled with heat. Buildings that had stood for 300 years were collapsing into themselves, their facades peeling away like skin from a corpse. Refugees who had survived the trek from the east now ran through streets turned to corridors of flame, their hair and clothing catching fire, their screams lost in the roar of combustion. Emergency crews fought to establish fire breaks, but there were too many fires, too few men, too little water. The Elbe itself seemed to boil in the reflected light. And then, at 01:23, the sirens wailed again. The second wave arrived with 759 bombers, targeting a city already ablaze. They dropped another 1,500 tons of high explosives and incendiaries onto streets now clogged with rubble and refugees, onto hospitals and parks where the wounded had been evacuated, onto neighborhoods that had escaped the first raid. The effect was catastrophic. The fires, already out of control, began to merge into a single entity, a firestorm that generated its own weather system. Superheated air rose in a column that reached 15,000 feet, creating winds at ground level that exceeded 100 miles per hour. These winds sucked oxygen from cellars and shelters, suffocating those who huddled within. They fed the flames with hurricane force, turning entire city blocks into blast furnaces where temperatures exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius. People caught in the open were lifted off their feet and hurled into the flames. Those who sought shelter in cellars died of carbon monoxide poisoning or were baked alive as the stones around them absorbed and radiated lethal heat. In the Altmark Square, where refugees had gathered in the open, believing it safer than enclosed spaces, the firestorm created a vortex that incinerated hundreds in minutes, leaving behind nothing but ash and shadows burned into the pavement. Schwerfällige reason had proven anything but clumsy. When dawn broke on February 14th, Dresden was gone. The city center, an area of nearly 4 square miles, had been effectively erased. The Frauenkirche, which had survived for 2 days of burning, finally collapsed, its sandstone walls cracking in the heat and folding inward like a dying flower. The Semperoper, the Zwinger Palace, the Kreuzkirche, all were gutted shells. The residential neighborhoods that surrounded the historic core had been leveled so thoroughly that streets were unrecognizable, their courses marked only by parallel lines of rubble. Bodies lay everywhere, some intact, some burned beyond recognition, some simply vanished in the heat. The exact death toll would never be known with certainty. Initial German estimates, inflated by Nazi propaganda, claimed 200,000 dead. Modern scholarship places the number between 25,000 and 35,000, still one of the deadliest air raids in history, still a toll that defied comprehension. At noon on February 14th, 316 B-17, flying fortresses of the United States 8th Air Force arrived over Dresden to bomb the rail yards. They flew in tight formation, their bomb bay doors opening in sequence, releasing their payloads with the mechanical precision of a factory assembly line. They encountered no fighter opposition. The flak was sporadic and ineffective. Below them, Dresden continued to burn. The smoke column was visible from 100 miles away, a black pillar that rose into the stratosphere and could be seen from the cockpits of bombers returning to England. The American crews, many flying their first missions, stared down at the inferno they had not created but now fed, and understood for the first time what strategic bombing actually meant. It was not the clean surgical operation depicted in training films. It was not about precision strikes on military targets. It was about destroying the enemy's capacity and will to resist by any means necessary. And if that meant burning cities and their inhabitants, then that was the price of victory. For the Germans who survived Dresden, the experience shattered every illusion they had held about the nature of the war. The schwerfällige Riesen were not clumsy. They were not inaccurate. They were not vulnerable. They were instruments of annihilation wielded by nations whose industrial capacity and strategic vision exceeded anything Germany could match or counter. The survivors spoke of the sound, the droning of engines that filled the sky like an approaching storm, a sound that was not loud so much as omnipresent, a vibration that entered through the ears and settled in the bones. That sound became the symbol of Allied power, the auditory embodiment of industrial democracy's terrible capability. In Berlin, in Munich, in every German city still standing, people listened for that sound with dread, knowing that when it came, there would be no defense, no shelter, no mercy. The bombing of Dresden became, in the decades that followed, a subject of intense historical controversy. Critics argued it was a war crime, an act of terror bombing with no legitimate military purpose, carried out when Germany was already defeated. Defenders pointed to Dresden's military installations, its role as a transport hub, the legitimate, strategic goals of disrupting German reinforcements to the Eastern Front. The truth, as is often the case, was more complex than either extreme. The survivors emerged on February 15th to a landscape that defied language. Where streets had been, there were now rivers of melted glass and twisted metal. Where homes had stood, there remained only the geometric outlines of foundations, marked by chimneys that rose from the rubble like gravestones. The air itself was different, thick with ash that settled on every surface like gray snow, carrying with it a smell that those who experienced it could never adequately describe. It was the smell of incinerated wood and stone, of chemicals burned. At temperatures they were never meant to withstand, of human remains mixed with everything else that had composed a living city. That smell would linger for months, seeping into the clothes and hair of rescue workers, into the nostrils of soldiers passing through on their way to the collapsing Eastern Front, into the consciousness of a nation that was only beginning to comprehend the magnitude of its defeat. The rescue efforts began immediately, though the word rescue was a cruel misnomer. There were few survivors to pull from the rubble. Instead, there were bodies to recover, rubble to clear, mass graves to dig. The city organized squads of Hitler Youth, firemen, and pressed refugees into service. They moved through the ruins wearing makeshift masks against the dust and stench, pulling corpses from cellars where entire families had suffocated together, finding in the open squares the calcified remains of people who had been caught in the firestorm's vortex. In the great parks along the Elbe, where thousands had sought refuge, believing the open space would protect them, they found scenes that suggested the end of the world. Bodies lay in heaps, shrunken and blackened by heat so intense it had reduced human beings to the size of children. Some victims had been caught while running, their bodies frozen in postures of flight. Others sat upright, seemingly untouched, killed by carbon monoxide before the flames could reach them. The rescue workers moved through this landscape in silence, their faces blank with shock, their hands performing tasks their minds could not yet process. Among those workers was a Wehrmacht sergeant named Klaus Weidner, who had been recovering from wounds received in the Ardennes offensive. He had arrived in Dresden on February 10th, believing the city a safe haven where he might recuperate before returning to his unit. He had survived the raids in a cellar beneath the Hauptbahnhof, the main railway station, emerging on the morning of February 15th to discover that the hospital where he had been staying was gone, along with everyone in it. In a letter to his wife written 3 weeks later, one of thousands of such letters that would be collected by historians studying the psychological impact of strategic bombing, Weidner described his experience in prose that moved between clinical detachment and barely controlled anguish. "We were told the enemy bombers were primitive," he wrote, "that they could not find their targets, that they scattered their bombs uselessly across empty fields. I have walked through Dresden. I have seen what they can do when they choose to focus their power. They did not miss. They did not scatter their bombs. They placed them exactly where they intended, and they returned to ensure the work was complete. We have been fighting a war we could never win, against an enemy whose capabilities we never understood." Weidner's letter captured something essential about the German experience of Dresden. A sense not just of physical devastation, but of cognitive collapse, a recognition that the entire framework through which Germany had understood the war was false. For 6 years, German propaganda had emphasized German technical superiority, German discipline, German will. The early victories, Poland, France, the Low Countries, had seemed to confirm this narrative. Even the setbacks in Russia had been explained as temporary, the result of weather and distance rather than fundamental military inadequacy. But Dresden could not be explained away. Dresden was not a tactical defeat or a temporary setback. Dresden was a demonstration of total superiority in industrial capacity, technical sophistication, and operational execution. The British had struck, at night with navigation aids so precise they could mark a single building in a blacked-out city. The Americans had struck in daylight with formations so large they darkened the sky, escorted by fighters that swept away what remained of the Luftwaffe. And they had done this while simultaneously fighting ground campaigns from Normandy to the Philippines, while supplying the Soviet Union with trucks and aircraft, while maintaining a standard of living for their populations that included rationed but adequate food, employment, entertainment. The disparity was so vast, it invalidated every assumption upon which the Third Reich had been built. In Berlin, where the government was now sheltering in bunkers beneath the Reich Chancellery, news of Dresden's destruction arrived like a funeral. Announcement. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, immediately recognized the event's potential for manipulation. His initial response was to inflate the death toll grotesquely, claiming that over 200,000 had died, that Dresden had been deliberately targeted as a cultural monument, that the bombing was proof of Anglo-American barbarism. These claims would echo through decades of post-war propaganda used by both Soviet and neo-Nazi sources to obscure German responsibility for the war. But privately, even Goebbels understood what Dresden represented. In his diary entry for February 16th, he wrote, "The attack on Dresden was an unparalleled catastrophe. The city is destroyed utterly. We cannot conceal this from the German people. Nor can we adequately explain it within our existing propaganda framework. If they can do this to Dresden, they can do it to any German city. The people are beginning to ask questions we cannot answer. Those questions multiplied as the bombing continued. On February 21st, Nuremberg was heavily bombed. On March 2nd, Cologne. On March 11th, Essen. On March 16th, Würzburg was struck by a force of over 200 bombers that created a firestorm similar to Dresden's, killing 5,000 in a city of 100,000. The pattern was clear. The Allies were methodically destroying every German city of size, targeting historical centers along with industrial zones, eliminating not just Germany's capacity to wage war, but the physical infrastructure of German civilization itself. To Germans living through this period, the bombing took on an apocalyptic quality. The sirens wailed nightly. The droning of engines became the soundtrack to Germany's death throes. In cellars and bunkers, families clutched one another and prayed, not for victory. That fantasy had died, but simply for survival, for the war to end before the bombers came to their city. The soldiers at the front received news of the bombings, through letters from home, through official announcements, through the whispered conversations that spread through any military formation when morale collapses. For many, Dresden marked a psychological breaking point. They had endured the grinding retreat from Russia, the savage fighting in Normandy, the desperate winter in the Ardennes. They had watched friends die for a cause that seemed increasingly hollow. But as long as home remained intact, as long as their families were safe, they could find meaning in continued resistance. Dresden shattered that illusion. If the homeland itself was burning, if their families were dying in firestorms while they fought in collapsing defensive lines, then what were they fighting for? Desertion rates increased sharply after mid-February. Officers reported difficulty maintaining discipline. Units that had fought with fanatical determination months earlier now surrendered at the first opportunity. The Wehrmacht was not just being defeated militarily, it was suffering a crisis of purpose, and Dresden had become the symbol of that crisis. Yet even in collapse, the German military continued to function with a discipline that astonished Allied commanders. The Eastern Front, though retreating, remained organized. Units withdrew in good order, conducted effective rearguard actions, extracted equipment that could be salvaged. In the West, German forces continued to resist, forcing the Allies to fight for every mile, every town, every river crossing. This was not the behavior of an army that had lost hope, and the contradiction puzzled Allied intelligence analysts. How could soldiers continue to fight effectively after everything they had experienced, after Dresden and 100 other disasters? The answer, when it emerged from prisoner interrogations and captured documents, was complex and disturbing. Some fought because they feared Soviet revenge more than Allied bombs. Some fought because they feared the consequences of desertion. The SS and Gestapo were executing defeatists in numbers that mounted daily. Some fought because obedience had been so thoroughly drilled into them that they could not conceive of doing otherwise. And some fought because even in the face of absolute defeat, even knowing the war was lost and the cause evil, they could not abandon the men beside them. Combat creates bonds that transcend ideology, and those bonds often prove stronger than reason or self-preservation. But among this spectrum of motivations, Dresden had planted a seed that would germinate in the rubble of the Third Reich and grow into something approaching historical honesty. The soldiers who survived the war, who returned to find their cities in ruins and their nation divided, carried with them the memory of that droning sound. In the decades that followed, as Germany struggled with its past, as it confronted the crimes committed in its name and the responsibility it bore for the war, that sound became a reminder of consequences. The Germans had unleashed total war with the bombing of Warsaw, Rotterdam, Coventry, London. They had pioneered the deliberate targeting of civilian populations, the erasure of cities in pursuit of terror and demoralization. What returned to Germany in 1945 was the doctrine Germany had written, amplified 1,000-fold by the industrial capacity of nations that could afford to build 10,000 heavy bombers and the trained crews to fly them. Dresden was not justice. Justice cannot be measured in tons of explosives or numbers of dead. But it was consequence, as pure and terrible as physics. The city would rise again, slowly, painfully. The rubble was cleared, the dead buried, the survivors gradually returning or replaced by new residents. The communist government of East Germany, which controlled Dresden after 1949, preserved the ruins of the Frauenkirche as a monument against war, allowing it to stand as a shattered reminder through 4 decades of Cold War. When Germany reunified in 1990, the church was reconstructed using original stones where possible, mixed with new material, its damaged exterior preserved as a historical record. The new Frauenkirche, completed in 2005, stands as both a restoration of what was lost and an acknowledgement that some losses cannot be undone, that history leaves scars even when wounds heal. But in February 1945, as the city burned and the survivors stumbled through streets they no longer recognized, there was no thought of reconstruction, no vision of a distant future. There was only the immediate present, the bodies that needed burial, the fires that still burned, the hunger and cold and despair, and over everything, the memory of that sound, the droning that had announced the end of one world and the beginning of another. Across Germany, in every city still standing, people listened for that sound with fatalistic dread. They heard it in Hamburg on March 8th, when 400 bombers struck the already devastated city. They heard it in Chemnitz on March 5, in Dessau on March 7th, in Pforzheim on February 23rd, where over 17,000 died in a single night's raid. The schwerfällige Riesen were not clumsy, and they were not finished. They flew with a regularity that suggested infinite resources, infinite patience, infinite determination. Each raid was a reminder that Germany was not fighting an enemy that could be exhausted or appeased. It was fighting industrial democracies whose capacity for war production exceeded Germany's entire economy, whose populations supported the war effort with resolve born of genuine grievance and moral clarity, whose leaders had learned the lessons of limited war and determined never to fight another. The droning of engines became, in the final months of the war, the sound of historical inevitability, the acoustic signature of a world order being born in fire and rubble. Germany had gambled everything on the belief that totalitarian efficiency and military excellence could overcome democratic softness and industrial abundance. Dresden was the final proof that this belief was catastrophically wrong. The democracies had proven capable of mobilizing their resources more effectively than any dictatorship, of matching German military skill with superior equipment and overwhelming numbers, of absorbing losses that would have broken a smaller power and continuing until the enemy was not just defeated, but utterly destroyed. When silence finally came to German skies in May 1945, when the bombers stopped flying because there were no more targets worth the fuel and munitions, that silence was more terrible than the droning had been. It was the silence of complete defeat, of a nation prostrate, of cities transformed to moonscapes where survivors picked through ruins searching for anything salvageable. In that silence, Germans began the long process of reckoning with what they had done and what had been done to them, of separating legitimate suffering from self-pity, of accepting responsibility while claiming the right to mourn. Dresden became central to that process, a city whose destruction was simultaneously a war crime and a logical consequence, a tragedy and a warning, a source of grief, and a reminder of the grief Germany had inflicted on others. The Schwerfällige reason, those clumsy giants that German propaganda had mocked and dismissed, had rewritten the rules of warfare and redefined the limits of human destruction. They had proven that in modern war there was no rear area, no safe city, no civilian population exempt from the calculus of violence. They had demonstrated that industrial capacity was military capacity, that democracies could mobilize their resources as effectively as dictatorships, and that technological superiority combined with economic abundance created a form of power against which courage and discipline offered no defense. These were hard lessons, written in ash and rubble, across the face of Germany, delivered by the droning of engines that would echo in German memory long after the last bomb fell and the last fire was extinguished.